The sun sets, the moon rises, and all that's familiar feels suddenly strange. In an age before streetlights, link boys carry torches to see city dwellers home, while in the countryside, starlight and moonlight are the only guides. The footpaths are out, a darker blackness against shadow. So for safety's sake, men walk together when they roll back from the coffee house, the tavern, and the club. And in the 18th century, clubs are everywhere. Clubs for singing, clubs for drinking, clubs of poets and pudding makers and politicians. One such gathering of like-minded men is the Lunar Society of Birmingham. They are a small, informal bunch who simply try to meet at each other's houses on the Monday nearest the full moon, to have light to ride home, hence the name. And like other clubs, they drink and laugh and argue into the night. But the lunar men are different. Together, they nudge their whole society and culture over the threshold of the modern, tilting it irrevocably away from old patterns of life toward the world we know today. So begins the prologue to author Jenny Uglow's The Lunar Men, an exploration of 5 key members of what was known as the Lunar Society of Birmingham, an extremely influential group of progressive-minded thinkers that did indeed nudge their whole society quite radically, sometimes for good and sometimes not, whose origins began way back in the 1760s. But why am I mentioning what some might consider some stodgy group of old guys from England? Well, in parts 1 and 2 of this series, we discovered that Western society was founded on not just certain principles or ideals contained within the Holy Bible, but rather it reflected belief in the historical accuracy of the entire biblical narrative, beginning in Genesis as its foundation. This, of course, commences with the notion of an initial very good creation that was marred by sin when the first man God created, Adam, rebelled against his creator, resulting in a fallen world, from which all of sinful mankind needed redemption, with the blessed hope of a fully restored new heavens and new earth coming in the future. And this, of course, was made available by faith, because of the birth, sinless life, and willing death of our Savior Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary, and his subsequent resurrection 3 days later, which proved his credentials as the perfect, sinless Son of God. Man was considered special, created in the image of God, and therefore worthy of dignity, rights, freedom, and pursuit of happiness, regardless of social stature. And the family unit, where biblical morality was taught and practiced, was considered the most basic and vitally important unit in society. However, we also demonstrated that the story of evolution, taught in the state-run education centers throughout the West as fact and science, has undermined the average person's trust not only in the plain reading of the Bible, thus rendering it unauthoritative in many people's minds, but in the very belief in the existence of God in many whatsoever. And the resultant rejection of biblical authority and moral dictates in culture has opened the floodgates for progressive activists to impose all manner of ideologies and institutions that operate in direct opposition to what would be considered traditional Western law, morality, ethical standards, and practices. Now, many people have a rather naive understanding of how the modern story of evolution came to be so firmly established in academia. It's often explained as a result of a certain Charles Darwin having gone on a 5-year journey around the world and simply discovering the undeniable evidence for it that was apparently just laying around for someone to find. Charles Darwin was an English naturalist whose scientific theory of evolution by natural selection became the foundation of modern evolutionary studies. An affable country gentleman, Darwin at first shocked religious Victorian society by suggesting that animals and humans shared a common ancestry. However, his non-religious biology appealed to the rising class of professional scientists, and by the time of his death, evolutionary imagery had spread through all of science, literature, and politics. Darwin formulated his bold theory in private in 1837-39, after returning from a voyage around the world aboard HMS Beagle. But it was not until 2 decades later that he finally gave it full public expression in On the Origin of Species in 1859. Now, notice how they emphasize that Darwin formulated his bold theory in private, almost as if they're trying to imply it was he alone that came up with this marvelous idea that nature itself somehow had the ability to create different life forms over millions of years of deep time. We'll challenge that notion shortly, but we should recognize the truth of what was stated in the final sentence here. His story of evolution did indeed deeply influence modern Western society and thought, as the logical conclusion for those that accepted this new narrative was that if nature could create, then there was no need of a supernatural creator, which also meant that even if you wanted to believe in God, the biblical account of creation had been falsified. And eventually, over time, it was promoted and became understood by many that if the Bible could no longer be taken as plainly read in one area, then it was no longer authoritative or to be trusted as an absolute standard of truth in any respect whatsoever, whether historic, scientific, or spiritually or morally for that matter. And because the seedbed of all Christian doctrines is found in the book of Genesis, this attack on the historicity of the Bible gradually eroded people's trust in the very bedrock of Western society. Indeed, Bible skeptic Ernst Mayr, one of the 20th century's leading evolutionary biologists, summed up how belief in the Bible was overturned by the story of evolution and its required millions of years timeline in an article titled "The Nature of the Darwinian Revolution," when he stated, "The revolution began when it became obvious that the Earth was very ancient rather than having been created only 6,000 years ago. This finding was the snowball that started the whole avalanche." Okay, so we can clearly see the how in answer to the question as to what happened to Western culture. And many might think we also have the who and why figured out as well, by thinking Charles Darwin just happened upon the facts of science that proved the story of evolution was true and things just worked themselves out from there. However, that would be historically false on a multitude of levels. For example, many people aren't aware there was literally a version of Darwinian evolution produced and published in a book called Zoonomia, a full 65 years before Origin of Species ever appeared, and which was written by Charles Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. And Erasmus was a founding member of the Lunar Society, the small but highly influential group of progressive thinkers I mentioned earlier, that met into the evening on the first Monday nearest the full moon to discuss, debate, and strategize ways and means to influence their society.